All right, welcome to the Return to Freud. In this Return to Freud, we are going to be covering a paper from 1915 titled The Unconscious. Funny enough, I checked there's no paper really that so explicitly focuses on the unconscious as a concept up until this point, although we have covered a paper called A Note on the Unconscious, which is more a side note reflection, which was covered in a previous video with a different paper. But this workshop is explicitly and exclusively on really a full-blown exploration of the way Freud's conceptualizing the unconscious from a topographical point of view, from a dynamical point of view, and from an economic point of view. It's kind of like a trinity or a triad that's emerging in Freud's thinking. And then, as always, we'll open it up to conversation. We've got a lot of people here today, a lot of new people here today, so we'll see how that goes. Let me share my screen. All right, so as I said, today we're covering a paper from 1915 titled The Unconscious. In the background there is a model that you're going to be seeing a lot in the slides. It's a classical model that Freud developed, which I think is helpful in thinking about the three aspects that Freud's interested in sharing with us: the topographical, the dynamical, and the economic aspect of the psyche. Of course, what's interesting here in the way Freud's conceptualizing the psyche, as it might differ from either things you've learned about the psyche in neuroscience or cognitive science, or maybe read about the psyche in popular representations, is that this is not a model of the brain, the first thing here, and also that this is not simply a reduction of consciousness to, this is not a reduction of the psyche to consciousness, but includes within it three registers, which Freud will demarcate and that you can see listed here as the perception consciousness system, the pre-conscious, and the unconscious. And we're going to get into the dynamics of these three registers throughout the presentation here. So before going in, I just want to let those of you watching on online know that the best way to support this work is through Patreon, where it's a good way to stay in touch with new projects, new courses, and also to support online work. Also to let you know about a new project that I've started called philosophyportal.online. It's a platform that I'm developing where I hope to offer at least 2 courses a year on great philosophical work. So if you want to get more involved in diving deep into philosophy and also working towards developing conferences online and books online, Philosophy Portal is a great place to check out. And also a link in the description to my PhD thesis, The Global Brain Singularity, which I published in 2020. And it basically was a 5 to 6 year meditation for me on subjectivity and temporality in the modern technological age. So links in the description to all of those. Now let's get into the paper. So The Unconscious from 1915, as we covered in a previous workshop, we specifically focused on repression. And so this idea won't be new to any of you who've attended before, but basically here Freud's repeating that the essence of repression is not in ending an idea. Repression returns. Repression does not eliminate an idea that represents an instinct, but rather prevents it from being conscious. So you can already see here that the the topographical and the economic and the dynamic view of the psyche for Freud is one in which the mind is in a type of tension, and one in which the mind is specifically struggling with the way in which instincts are represented ideationally. So what's crucial here, and this distinction should not be lost in any way, I think it's crucial that we don't lose this distinction, is that Freud is talking about the way instincts are represented by ideas, and thinking about the way our conscious psyche struggles with instinctual representation. So the repressed idea is linked to the unconscious and can produce effects in the preconscious through the preconscious and conscious systems. But the weird thing and in some sense, the, let's say, difficult thing about our minds is that it's not only the repressed ideas which are unconscious, but also the mechanism of repression itself is unconscious. Not totally, but in part. And that straddles the line between the preconscious and the conscious. And we're going to go into some of the ways in which that works. But the unconscious itself is only known when it has an unconscious inclusive of the ideas and the mechanism of repression is only known when it has undergone the translation to consciousness through analytical work, which basically involves, as we've known and covered many times in previous workshops, the overcoming of resistances. So there's a way in which doing analytic work is really working against what our consciousness identifies with as pleasurable. And it is fundamentally a process where there's going to be tension, where there's going to be conflict, where there's going to be struggle with bringing to consciousness the repressed contents. And that has to do with basically overcoming the very mechanisms by which the content became repressed in the first place. So as ideational representations of instinct which consciousness did not want to admit, or preconscious systems did not want to admit, did not make it past censorship, become repressed. The existence of the unconscious psyche as an object of serious scientific study, and this is something that Freud repeats and has repeated many times up to this point in his career, is something that's disputed by many scientists. And I would like to echo that this resistance, let's say, within the scientific community to the unconscious is not only paradoxical and ironic, but is still very much present. It's not like we're making linear progress in understanding. It's not like the unconscious is gradually being more and more accepted as something that we can legitimately talk about and work with. It's much more, it's operating on a much different temporal relationship to knowledge than, I guess, the way most paradigms become accepted in academic structures. However, for Freud, the unconscious is a necessary assumption, namely because data of consciousness have a very large number of gaps in the healthy and the sick alike. So at least for Freud, he's emphasizing here that psychoanalysis does not just have consequences for sick people or neurotic people, but we all have an unconscious, and we're all a little bit neurotic in any case. But even if we were to label someone as having a quote unquote healthy psyche, that does not mean that the person does not have an unconscious, that the unconscious is not just a function of neurosis, hysteria, and other psychic problems. The specific gaps Freud's talking about here are parapraxis, slips of the tongue. So for example, in the Freudian Unconscious group on Facebook, Richard Konigsberg brought our attention to a very hilarious slip of the tongue by Mitch McConnell this past week, which I had come across on my own, where he said basically African Americans are voting just as much as Americans. You know, that's a slip of the tongue, which says a lot about Mitch McConnell. So that's an example of a gap that Freud's talking about here. Very practical, has political consequences. Also, dreams in healthy people are examples of the unconscious. We are not fully conscious of our dreams, especially adults, as we've covered in previous workshops on dreams. Children are far more conscious. Their dreams are far more, let's say, easy to interpret, whereas the dreams of even healthy adults are often dramatically censored and in massive distortions between latent and manifest content. In sick people, the unconscious emerges in symptoms, psychic symptoms, which could be obsessions, which could be hysterical outbursts, which could be tics, other maladies. And in daily experience, just common experience, ideas that come to us seemingly from nowhere. Ideas, if you pay attention to your psyche, the more I reflect, for example, on my psyche using the models of consciousness, pre-consciousness, and unconscious. I mean, the pre-conscious is, and according to Freud as well, pre-conscious is to some degree available to consciousness if you're paying close attention. And I think these are very useful systems with which to categorize the way our psyche works. And the ideas that seemingly come to us seemingly out of nowhere are observable on this boundary line between the pre-conscious and the conscious. And it's interesting to pay attention to how that functions in daydreaming, in terms of what you're motivated by, and actually what your mind is doing, even in moments of rest and meditation. These examples, he suggests, are unintelligible. We cannot make sense of these dimensions of the mind unless we insist on the fact that mental acts are not totally conscious. In the other way of saying it, if we do insist that all mental acts are conscious, it's impossible to make sense of parapraxies, slips of the tongue, dreams, ideas that come out of nowhere, symptoms and obsessions, which are really essential to study and essential to understand on any meaningful spiritual pathway where you're actually interested in understanding yourself. So the unconscious does have also spiritual implications, I think. The assumption of the unconscious allows analytic work, most importantly, and Freud takes this as really the core of his argument for assuming the unconscious, that it exerts an effective influence upon conscious processes, and that analytic work can make use of this, and that there can be significant progress in understanding why someone is struggling with a certain symptom, or why someone is struggling with a certain motivational affect or obsession. Of course, it requires that we work through resistances, and which is the sort of like the price of admission to do meaningful analytic work. And that's why in my own intellectual career, I often point towards the importance of thinkers who can fight against their own thought, who can work against their own thought in some meaningful way, instead of, let's say, being extremely defensive with a certain mode of thinking. This is, I think, important outside of analysis. In any case, to adopt a position that whatever goes on in the mind, so Freud here concludes on this line of reasoning, that to adopt the position that whatever goes on in the mind must be known to consciousness is untenable. So the most simple way to describe this is that Freud is basically, and this is a theme throughout his work, is that the simplest way to understand how he's developing the concept of the unconscious is that he's against the equation that consciousness is equal to the psyche. This is in logical formulation, going against the logic of A equals A. He's saying the conscious and the psyche are not equal to each other. That in order to broaden our concept of the psyche, we have to include other systems, the preconscious and the unconscious, which is, I think, very simple to understand once you get your mind around it. So consciousness includes, now, to even blow this paradigm even further from the standard psychological paradigm of at least Freud's time, is that consciousness includes a smaller content, what he calls manifest, and the unconscious includes the greater content, what he calls latent. And this relationship between manifest and latent content is also crucial for understanding the dream work, and understanding how Freud first started interpreting dreams. And I encourage everyone to check out the workshops we did on dreams if they haven't yet. But that mechanisms are fully described in those workshops. So that taking into account all of our latent memories makes the existence of the unconscious undeniable, namely that our psyche includes, let's say, a large, enormous amount of memories of our past, which are almost never completely conscious. And yet is still a part of our psyche, and even still exerting efficacy on our consciousness through the preconscious systems. And so when you're thinking about the psyche from a Freudian point of view, it's not that you're constantly in the past, this is a criticism that's often leveled at Freud. It's much more that the past is operating and having an effect on the present. That the things that happened in the past are still present within your psyche and having a meaningful effect on the way you're interpreting the present. And again, I think this has enormous political and spiritual consequences. So the rejection of the unconscious is, and this is reflecting what I said in the previous slide, but this is just stating it explicitly, is that rejection of the unconscious is based on the equation taken as axiomatic that the psyche equals consciousness, or the mind equals consciousness. So you want to think about the psyche or the mind as the dominant category that Freud is using, the all-inclusive concept, and consciousness as actually peripheral. Consciousness in psychoanalysis is actually decentered. It's not the center. Your consciousness is not really the center of psychology for Freud. And that is, as long as you grasp that distinction, I think that that's really even the most important distinction to take away from really what Freud's observing and working with. It says, what we know with certainty about the unconscious is that these psychic states are totally inaccessible to us, and they are in contact, and yet still they are in contact with the conscious mind. Now, this fact brings up many connections to the philosophical traditions of German idealism, which we're going to explicitly address in the slides to come. But for now, the most important distinction to keep in mind is that the unconscious in itself, although it exerts an efficacy, is inaccessible in itself. Again, the crucial thing is that the only way in which it's accessible is through the ideational representatives of instinct, that we don't have access to the instincts themselves. And that, if you want to learn more about that, there's a workshop we did on instincts and their vicissitudes, which goes into great detail on that point. However, through analytic work, these unconscious states of the psyche can be transformed into conscious states ideationally, with a meaningful transformation once they've been brought to consciousness, that there is a meaningful work that's performed when the unconscious representative becomes consciously representative. That does make a difference. The only way the latent unconscious states differ from manifest conscious states is in terms of their absence. So that's very interesting, because he's basically saying that this mechanism of presence and absence is metaphysically what's useful to think when we're thinking about this topography of the mind. And the easiest way I make sense of this is to just simply understand the prefix of the unconscious. Un means not. So you can think about this as states in their absence, but the not conscious has an effect on our conscious. It's just a little logical trick. With that being said, these latent psychological states or absent psychological states have not been subjected to study outside of psychoanalysis, even though that we were aware of these states pre-analysis via hypnosis. And that takes us back to our early workshops, where we specifically were working with a Freud who was himself using hypnosis. In the early days of psychoanalysis, it was not simply free association that was emphasized as a tool to better understand unconscious states, but also hypnosis, because it I don't know the best way to say it. It allows for a reduction in the strength of the ego barriers to the pre-conscious and the unconscious material. The downside of hypnosis, as we've covered in previous workshops, is simply that all of the history of the unconscious, which is sort of revealed in its bare state, is not necessarily the best way for long-term growth with overcoming symptom formation, that you actually have to talk it out, that it has to pass through the symbolic, let's say. There's no getting around the symbolic for psychoanalysis. However, in assuming the unconscious, it does not mean we have to depart from our normal mode of thinking. In other words, what we have taken as our normal rational mode of thinking in the scientific tradition is not something that we have to depart from in accepting the basic claims of psychoanalysis. It's simply that we have to, as it were, apply the same skepticism and criticism and doubt that we so readily adopt in the scientific point of view, or the standard scientific naturalist scientific point of view, and apply it to the very mental life inside of us. And I think this is why psychoanalysis gets so much resistance in the sciences, is because it irreducibly involves us. It irreducibly involves our particular subjectivity. In a Hegelian way of framing psychoanalysis as its historicity, there's basically the claim that the unconscious as a universality irreducibly involves us in our particularity, and that in order to work through that universality, which is moving through us particularly, we have the opportunity to reach, say, a singularity, or the deeper knowing about what we really are. But if science is resisting that process, then we can say that the contemporary mode of science, the way it appears in the past century, is actually obfuscating or in the way of us really getting a deeper understanding of what we are. Now, why might that be? So the process of inference applied to the self, despite internal opposition, there's always going to be internal opposition, even still does not disclose the unconscious, but rather creates a second consciousness. So in other words, even if we overcome the hurdle of accepting the unconscious, simply, let's say, thinking about the unconscious from the perspective of the conscious does not reveal the contents of the unconscious. But, and I think this is very clever, Freud says, but rather creates a second consciousness, never mind a consciousness of the unconscious, but not the unconscious in itself. And this is a very clever distinction he's making there. Basically, he's saying, again, there's no way out of the mechanism of free association. There's no way out of letting the unconscious speak on its own terms. And that's all the hurdle with psychoanalytic work, really. And this is troubling. So analytic investigation reveals that latent processes have characteristics and peculiarities which, quote unquote, seem alien to us. I love that metaphor of the alien. And they run counter to familiar attributes of consciousness. So the unconscious is absent from our consciousness. It's not conscious. We know that they are ideational representations of instincts, and that these ideas of the unconscious appear alien to our consciousness. So we cannot make a quote unquote second consciousness out of them, but have to, let's say, let them speak, give them room to be expressed. This totally disturbs, obviously, institutional psychology, which might be actually the reason why there's so much trouble with psychoanalysis historically. It's not clear how one institutionalizes such knowledge. There's no choice but to assume mental processes are in themselves unconscious, like perception. Though here he starts to get into territory which borders on radical philosophy. He says there's no choice but to assume mental processes are in themselves unconscious, like perception of them to the external world detected by the sense organs. So he's basically saying, in the same way that our sense organs detect the external world, this is the same relationship we should think between our perception consciousness system and the unconscious. So to put it in simple language, in the same way that there's an external world, there's also an internal world, which we should view of as basically another world that we are observing within ourselves. We are a world unto ourselves, the unconscious. And this has, again, like I was saying, philosophical consequences. So he explicitly refers to Kant and says, in the same way that Kant corrected our views on external perception, saying basically that our perceptions are subjectively conditioned and we're not observing the world in itself the way it is independent of us, but always viewing the world through our own subjective condition, phenomena, the distinction phenomena and not noumena. Freud suggests that psychoanalysis is similar, although that this is moving the same logic into an internal relationship. So we do not equate perceptions by means of consciousness with unconscious mental processes, again, phenomena and not noumena. So here, I mean, really what's at stake here is thinking about what is the noumena as it relates to the phenomena in terms of the unconscious. I think how Freud's been thinking about it is that the instincts themselves are noumenal, whereas the ideational representations of those instincts are potentially phenomenal. However, the internal objects are less unknowable than the objects of the external world. And I think here Freud demonstrates a weakness and a limitation. And perhaps he underestimates the fact that just because the internal objects are less unknowable, quote unquote, I think what he underestimates is the degree to which subjects must submit to knowing this unknowability when it comes to our own subjectivity. Whereas when it comes to exploring the external world, there doesn't necessarily imply the same type of inner resistance. Although there can be extreme inner resistance, like humans had extreme inner resistance to accepting the Copernican model of the universe. Humans had extreme resistance to accepting the Darwinian picture of the universe. However, when it comes to the psychoanalytic view of the universe, I think it becomes so intimate that there's even greater resistance. The positive finding of psychoanalysis is that psychical acts pass two phases between which there is a test or a censorship. Phase one is the unconscious. Upon testing, if rejected by censorship, it does not pass to the second phase and becomes repressed by the preconscious. The second phase is the conscious, and here he's combining the distinctions between the preconscious and the conscious, where upon passing the test, they enter the second system, the preconscious, with the capacity to become conscious. So if you think about your body, as you see in the representation on the right-hand side, the body is the lowest level. You see here the instincts of the body, the force of the body, which the mind cannot escape, undergo a first test. If they pass through this first test, meaning that they're not censored, then they potentially pass to the preconscious, and then they go through a second test where they can potentially pass through the consciousness. All of this has to do in some sense with the way in which one's mind is accepting, let's say, the reality of the body or the reality of one's entire history, not just the body, but also the body as a historical process, which includes one's childhood, which includes one's birth, which includes one's social, intimate relationships. The phase two character is that it's not unequivocally conscious, meaning when it's potentially can pass to consciousness. The crucial thing is that now this information can make it to consciousness without any resistance whatsoever. Whereas with the unconscious material, not only is the material still unconscious, but even the very mechanism of resistance is unconscious. Here he demarcates a topography of three dynamic systems, which he says separate psychoanalysis from psychology, and I've gone over what those three systems are. This is, I think, very crucial information here, is that Freud's psychological topography is unrelated to brain anatomy. So when Freud's thinking about the psyche, he's thinking about the representation you see above the brain there, which he states is dependent in some ways, importantly, on the brain as an organ, but he's not thinking about the brain anatomy. He sees the brain anatomy as, in some sense, the focus on it as getting in the way of understanding the psyche as it is. So today there's too much, I think, emphasis on, because we have the technological capacity to see how the brain works, to understand the neuronal connections and so forth, to make correlations between neuronal action and psychological experience. There's a obfuscation of, let's say, the psychic life, the life of the psyche. So I've said this before, but here's to reiterate that in Freud's view, an instinct can never become an object of consciousness, only the idea representing an instinct. Even in the unconscious, the instinct cannot be represented other than by an idea, and the instinct in itself is unknowable. So this is why I made the emphasis on saying the way Freud's conceptualizing instinct is in some sense noumenal, whereas the way he's conceptualizing the unconscious idea is in some sense phenomenal. Now, the unconscious ideas of instincts undergo repression. The ideas are what undergo repression, not the instincts themselves, which cannot be, say, repressed or gotten rid of, but their ideas can be repressed. And consequently, emotions and affects get connected to misconstrued representations of their true connection. So there are many funny examples of this I've observed in my own life where people get, and in my own, also my own personal emotional existence, where people become very emotionally or affectively charged over representations which are not really, it's not really what they care about. I think this happens a lot in politics, where people get caught up in big political movements, or people get caught up in big, say, social games because of a misconstrued connection as it relates to their emotions, their affects, and their unconscious ideas and instincts. The degree to which this dynamic shapes contemporary political conflicts as it relates to identity, as it relates to gender, as it relates to many other dimensions, is, I think, understated. So the emotional vicissitudes of repressed instinctual ideas undergo repression, which true aim is the repression of affect. So I think that this captures a lot of how modern institutions handle psychology, which is basically to reduce any emergence of intense affect. I've seen this in my own work, working for psychedelic companies, for example, where all of the standard or the most dominantly affected, the most dominantly supported psychological models and tools are basically trying to work from a disembodied, rational perspective, which doesn't allow the emergence of intense affect, which doesn't allow, for certain, the noumenal dimension of the unconscious to emerge to the surface and be represented. Repression can inhibit instinctual impulses from being turned into a manifestation of affect. And there's no real solution to this problem from a psychoanalytic point of view. There's simply the recognition of a constant struggle between the conscious and the unconscious for primacy over affectivity. And the conscious primacy is what we call normalcy. As we've discussed in previous workshops, it's really difficult to say what is normative or what is normal in psychoanalysis, because almost everything is perceived as a type of deviation, since we are all, in some sense, subjects of the unconscious. It's basically whatever consciousness calls normal is normal for that time. It says repression is essentially a processing of affective ideas on the border between unconscious and preconscious. And again, the mechanism of repression itself is unconscious. However, repressed ideas remain capable of action in the unconscious and anticathexis in the preconscious, which is basically a concentration of mental energy, must protect us from the unconscious. So not only is there a concentration of mental energy in the unconscious which wants to be expressed, but there's also a opposite energy, which is the preconscious, which is directed against the unconscious from becoming conscious. The economic view is the anti-cathexis operating in the preconscious guarantees the permanence of repression, cannot get rid of it completely. And the way in which the anti-cathexis of the preconscious is operating on the unconscious is, for Freud, how one would determine from an economic point of view the difference between anxiety hysteria, conversion hysteria, and obsessional neuroses, which I encourage you to read it deeper into the paper itself, where he sort of describes each of these three distinctions in great detail. And also, we've covered these three distinctions before in previous workshops. The nucleus of the unconscious consists in instinctual representations which seek discharge of their mental concentration, the cathexis, or the wishes. This is connected to the idea in Freud that the unconscious is a wish fulfillment, that the unconscious has a deep relationship to desire. He says that when two wishful impulses are in contradiction, they combine to form a compromise formation that's worked out in the unconscious or the preconscious. However, the unconscious in itself does not do this. So in other words, when you are working through contradictions of desire, this is occurring on the level of the preconscious, the tension between the preconscious and the unconscious. Sometimes you may make compromise formations inside yourself without even knowing you've done it. However, the processes in the system of the unconscious are timeless, not ordered by temporality, and with no reference to reality at all. Here, Freud creates an equation which basically suggests that time equals consciousness. Time equals consciousness. Consciousness equals time. In the unconscious, there is no time for Freud. The unconscious subject is subject to the pleasure principle, namely the unconscious is striving for pleasure. Unconscious would like to enact and realize this pleasure, this desire. And he says the fate of the unconscious depends on how strong it is and the demands and regulations on the pleasure-unpleasure principle. Of course, in growing up, in becoming adults, this is why most of our dreams are filtered through many layers of censorship, because we have to compromise with the pleasure principle, and we have to regulate ourselves, both internally and are regulated by society, in order to conform, in order to fit into a certain idea of what consciousness views as normal. The unconscious has, as this is connected to previous things I was saying about the unconscious, is both exempted from contradiction and compromise. And again, to repeat, the unconscious has no recognition of time or external reality. So it's a very strange dimension of the psyche in itself. You can think the psyche in itself is timeless. The psyche in itself has its own reality. So the unconscious in itself is cognizable in conditions of dreaming and neurosis by the preconscious, but again, is noumenal in itself. In themselves, uncognizable. I think there's a few slides left. It says the unconscious is alive and capable of development. He maintains that there are a number of other non-repressed relations with the preconscious. That to consciousness, the whole sum of psychical processes presents as the preconscious realm, even though great parts of it appear in the unconscious. So what that means is that, again, as I've alluded to before, most of what we know about the unconscious is as we interpret the unconscious through the preconscious. And he's making the claim here at the bottom that we must emancipate ourselves from the importance of the symptom of quote unquote being conscious. And so you can see why this is an enormous threat to standard interpretations of psychology at the time, and I would say even today. Whereas at his time, consciousness and the psyche were seen as one, he's saying that the importance of being conscious should be something we overcome. The content of the preconscious and the conscious is derived partly from instinctual life through medium of the unconscious and partly from perception. He emphasizes that total severance between the unconscious and the preconscious conscious systems is what characterizes illness. So basically, one goes to psychoanalysis to investigate the nature of the unconscious when the split within one's own mind is so enormous that you basically, your life is unlivable. Your symptoms, your obsessions, your neuroses are making your life so unlivable that you have to figure out what's going on inside your own mind. He makes a very interesting analogy or metaphor between the unconscious contents as compared to an aboriginal population in the mind, plus unserviceable childhood impulse, basically a combination of animal instincts and unserviceable childhood impulses. That this is the floor of our psyche. This is the zero level of our psyche, is a type of, you can think here about other scientists who have published works like the Society of Mind. It's like having a little society of voices, a society of impulses and drives, a multiplicity of chaotic drives in one's head. And that's the sort of one way of thinking about the zero level of the unconscious. It says, all we can say about the unconscious from dream life and transference neuroses, again, as distinct from the non-transference neuroses, which we're going to talk a little bit about. At this point in Freud's career, he's reflecting a lot more on this distinction between the transference neuroses and the non-transference neuroses. He says, what we do learn from psychoanalysis up to this point leaves us in some confusion and obscurity. However, he makes the interesting point that in the narcissistic psychoneuroses, and we did an entire workshop on narcissism, which I encourage to check out if you haven't seen it yet. In any case, he says the narcissistic psychoneuroses promise to furnish us with conceptions through the enigmatic unconscious in the way that the narcissist relates to the unconscious differently than does the neurotic. He says narcissists are in a primitive objectless condition, are incapable of transference, namely the transference neuroses having to do with love and the failure of the other and the external object, are thus inaccessible to therapy and have a hypercathexis, a hyper mental concentration on their own ego and a general rejection of the external. You can basically say here the narcissist, Freud is not moralizing narcissism, but describing the narcissist as actually in some positive way, capable of bringing more of the unconscious to consciousness, which is extremely interesting, especially because in our time, especially on the internet, there is a common expression that we are in a narcissistic age. One wonders what Freud would have thought about this age, given its tendencies to narcissistic self-identification, representation of parts of the psyche, especially the, say, more instinctual animalistic representations of the unconscious within the digital. This is, I think, very important to think today. A few more slides here. Also, not only narcissism, but also schizophrenia is an example of the non-transference neuroses, where he again likens schizophrenia to a dimension of the mind which is expressing the unconscious in a different way than we see expressed in the transference neuroses. One can also say schizophrenia, like narcissism, is beyond analytic care, analytic therapy. He says the schizophrenic has a peculiar care to the way he or she is expressing, becoming stilted, precious, and incomprehensible in one's speech. This is very important to think. And one of the most interesting distinctions here at the end Freud makes is the distinction between the way conscious presentation compromises between a thing and the word, the noumena and the phenomena belonging to it, whereas the unconscious presents the thing alone, without compromise, without, again, the unconscious representation of the thing has less concern for contradiction, for compromise, for time, for external reality. All of these things are much reduced. And you see the image there of the signifier and the signified. That is important to consider for the next slide, where I'm going to represent the Lacanian formula of this relationship, where the signifier is over the signified. And I think this also gives us a key and a clue to understanding the ways in which the unconscious is represented, perhaps in a different way than in the transference neuroses that Freud is talking about. It says repression in transference neuroses denies translation into words attached to the object. So really the struggle that the neurotic has is representing his unconscious or representing her unconscious. And that's also why free association and the passage through the symbolic order is so important for psychoanalysis. He says a presentation that's not put into words remains thereafter in the unconscious in a state of repression. So can we think here about how we might repress, or represent differently? This makes me think about Freud's previous work on creative writers, his previous work on art in general, the way Freud often refers to art as a domain beyond analysis, and at least in Freud's own personal proclivity, as a dimension which points and transcends beyond analysis. As a philosopher, I would say philosophy, and I would say also in a Hegelian sense, religion is another dimension beyond psychoanalysis potentially that is interesting to think as it relates to this dynamic between the signifier and the signified. It says ultimately the ego's flight from the unconscious, as we know in repression, is impossible, and this impossible flight from the unconscious, which manifests so strongly in the neurotic, is put to operation actively in the narcissistic neuroses. And I think that's where we're going to end this paper. Very interesting to reflect on this distinction that Freud is making more and more between the transference and the non-transference neuroses. And I would just like to remind everyone watching online that the best way to help this work is through Patreon. There's also a new initiative on Philosophy Portal, which might be interesting to check out, where I offer different philosophical works throughout the year. And a link to my PhD thesis is also in the description, which is basically a meditation on subjectivity and temporality in the 21st century. So thank you all for your patience and for your attention. And I will stop sharing my screen now. And the floor is open.
Well, I'll get things started. Cadell, thank you so much for taking us through this. I think one of Freud's more difficult texts, especially towards the end. I kind of think that it was not until Freud went off topic a little bit, that kind of almost illustrating the concept of the unconscious, that he really gets to the heart of the matter in this last chapter. And I want to focus a little bit on this last chapter and give a kind of Lacanian valence to it as a way of looking at precisely how Lacan makes an advance on the Freudian unconscious and how his notion of the unconscious develops from it. And to begin, I want to draw attention to some of the problems in the translation. Strachey's translation, he begins early on in his translation, translating the word Vorstellung as idea, or the idea representation of unconscious drive impulses. And this word Vorstellung here is of course laden with meaning from in the German philosophical tradition, and so just reducing it to the concept of an idea, I think, is unfortunate. Where it has this notion of Stellung, setting out, putting out, before, and then this last chapter, he switches, and there's a footnote about it, but he switches and he translates it as presentation, which is, I think, perhaps a better rendering of that word. But it is this notion of the Vorstellung that is, I think, the most crucial and the most important part of Freud's discovery here. And what he does is he splits this Vorstellung, this representation of the drive impulse, into two parts: the Wortvorstellung, the Wort representate, and the Sache representate, the word representative and the thing representative. And in here we're also encountering another difficulty in translation, because I think we make a mistake in immediately connecting this difference between word and thing to the Saussurean signifier and signified. And this is where Lacan was accused of getting it wrong and he brings this up in Seminar 7 in his discussion of Das Ding. Because Lacan, of course, is famous for saying that the unconscious is structured like a language. But if it is the thing representation that is repressed into the unconscious, and the word representation is not repressed, then Lacan must be wrong, right? So what Lacan does is he says, yes, but in German, there are two words for thing. There is das Ding and die Sache. And this is die Sache that is the one that Freud uses. And we can understand this word die Sache as meaning something like subject matter or the issue or something. It's beyond a concrete thing. And so what Lacan is careful to do is to locate this noumenal thing, the beyond of the signified, as das Ding is what he calls it, the thing, and the Sache that is repressed is, and this is the distinction that he makes here, and I think it's really important. It is not the word, but it is the signifier. That is to say, the word, the Wort in German, that is not repressed, we could think of it as the signifier as a whole. I mean, I'm sorry, the sign, the linguistic sign as a whole, both in terms of the signifier and the signified together. But what is repressed is the splitting of the sign into, and what remains is the Sache, which is the signifier. And so what is the signifier here? It's different from the word itself. It's a representation, but what it is it's the word in its symbolic context that is within the symbolic order. It is the concept stripped of its signified, but it retains its place within the signifying chain. That is its position within the network of signifiers in the symbolic order. And so this is what Lacan uses to develop his, I think, advancement over Freud in his notion of the unconscious. And you can read about this in the second session of Seminar 11, which he entitles The Difference Between the Freudian Unconscious and Ours. And it is precisely this notion here that he develops, that the unconscious is not a place within the psyche, or the brain. It's not, it doesn't have ontological status. The unconscious is precisely this gap within the symbolic order itself that has an effect on the subject, or that brings the subject out into it. And so it's something that entails both the individual and something that is outside of the individual that is already existing, that he likens to like a magnetic field. It's a field that's outside this symbolic order that pre-exists, and that as the subject is born into it, it already structures our psyche in a particular way. So there's a lot there, but I just want to make that distinction, I think, that Lacan himself makes, so that we don't immediately think of this distinction between the word presentation and the thing representation as being equivalent to the Saussurean signifier signified, because it is crucial to understand exactly how Lacan himself develops his notion of the unconscious.
Yeah, there's a lot there. What's standing out for me is the relationship between the unconscious as a gap and the development of the signifier in that gap, or the development of the signifier in that lack. That's which is what's at stake in the interpretation you're giving of Lacan. I want to maybe phrase it as a question back to you, that I have a way of representing this in my head, but I want to throw it as a question to see if it's also the way you're thinking about it. Could it be that Freud is thinking about it at this point in his career as the split within the subject between the conscious and the unconscious as instincts? But that this way of representing the relationship between consciousness and unconsciousness changes after he discovers the death drive, where he becomes much more aware of the gap, the unconscious as an ontological gap itself. Because the way I think about it is that there's two Freuds. Like, there's a Freud before really going into the death drive and a Freud after. and that this involves a different relationship to the unconscious and its ontological status. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, that's a difficult question.
Yeah.
I think you're definitely right. I'm not sure, without giving it some more thought, exactly how I would answer that question. I think what is at stake here is what Lacan develops in the notion of the symbolic order that is external to the subject, or that is external to the individual, that the subject emerges in it. In other words, it is the repression of the signifier, the Sache, that creates the unconscious, that is the unconscious subject. And this is as much something external, other to the subject, or to the person, to the individual, as it is something within them. And I think we have this topological model of the unconscious as being within us and kind of buried below. But Lacan's point is that the unconscious is as much external to us as it is within us. And I'll give a Hegelian kind of valence to this. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, at the very end of the section on reason, I believe that's where it is, he begins to talk about, and he uses this word Sache, die Sache selbst, the thing itself, the subject matter, the crux of the matter, I think is how Miller translates it. And it's this point where internal reason, of course, Hegel is talking about conscious reason, becomes externalized and becomes the property not just of a single individual, but of the collective. And so thought, reason, becomes the thing itself, the subject matter itself, the crux of the matter, insofar as it is externalized. Okay, so the unconscious, insofar as it is a repression of the Sache, is the way in which the subject, the individual and the subject of the unconscious, is determined and by something external to it. And I think that is where Lacan represents an advancement on Freud. But I think Freud is there. I think he has it, but I think it's so difficult to tease out in his language, and because that last chapter is so dense.
Yeah, it is extremely dense. I just wanted to say that in relationship to what you're saying, I see Freud as much more focused on getting the psyche right. I mean, his mind's on psychology, whereas I feel like the way in which you're describing the way Lacan extends Freud is it necessarily brings us into topics of sociology and anthropology. The way in which the consequences of the unconscious and the consequences of thinking, the unconscious that Freud discovered has consequences for politics and religion.
But Freud is already there too, I think, with his totem and taboo. And when Lacan discusses this issue in Seminar 11, he actually calls it the totemic function of the unconscious. And he brings in Claude Lévi-Strauss. So it is definitely something anthropological, but Freud's already really in that space, I think, already.
I want to let other people talk, but my last question for you would be, why do you think Freud develops the topographical model that he does without much reference to group psychology or the social in at least in this paper? Is it for practical reasons? Is it to stay focused on the topic of the psyche?
Yeah,
Is it because of the way in which he's working in an analytic context?
I think that's true. I think he's thinking in terms of the analytic or the clinical setting, where you're dealing with a certain individual. Of course, in his paper, Group Psychology, he does deal with the concept of the group and the notion of the ego, and how he talks about the introjection of an object into the ego. So he does begin to apply his topographical model, at least the second topology, to social issues. But yeah, I think Freud here is still very much, Dr. Freud.
Right. Yeah. Makes a lot of sense. I just think there's a lot at stake here in what you're bringing up as it relates to psychology and anthropology, and also just because in my own intellectual sort of networks and I think in the broader intellectual discussion, there's just been so much reference to Girard, and there's so much reference to anthropological conflict that I wonder if the way Lacan develops Freud opens up these questions and their relationship to contemporary understanding of Girard in a different way, or gives us different perspective.
I'm not as familiar with Girard, but I do think that there needs to be a lot of work done in fleshing out the Lacanian unconscious in terms of its externality, what he would call extimate.
Yeah.
And how that differs from the Jungian notion of the collective unconscious, because one might think, oh, Lacan is sort of bringing the unconscious into this external, socialized collectivity. But I think that is still very, very different than any Jungian notion of a collective unconscious.
Yeah, great.
But there may be some connections or similarities that other people might be able to tease out. But I'll shut up now.
Yeah. Does anyone else have either a reflection on what Eric's been talking about, or some other orientation might want to take the conversation?
Yeah. Well, I think one, I'd like to either ask for a clarification on one thing. I don't know if I remember correctly, but is it when Freud was talking about the conscious being the word as representation plus the thing as representation, and then the unconscious just being the thing as representation? Is that something that I understood correctly? Is that something that was said? Because I was...
Yeah. Yeah. Did you want to respond to that, Eric?
Yeah, that's correct, Javier. What is repressed is the Zaka, the thing representation, which again, I'm distinguishing here with Lacan that it's not the thing itself, the Kantian thing itself, but it is a signifier still. But it's a signifier that's stripped of its function as a word, because a word is a sign, a full linguistic sign. And Freud himself makes this distinction in that chapter when he starts talking about schizophrenia, when he starts talking about the difference between the hysteric and the schizophrenic, where the schizophrenic has a certain experience of the word itself in the same manner that the neurotic, the hysteric, would only experience the signifier, the Zaka. And so, if you go back and you read really, really carefully that last chapter 7, I think Freud is making that distinction. And so we have to understand this crucial difference between the function of the word and how it affects the the psychotic, the schizophrenic, and how in repression the word is stripped of something, and that something is the Sache, which Lacan says is a signifier, and that's what is repressed. So the thing itself and the word itself remains unrepressed. It's out there. And this is why neurotics can actually use the same words that they've repressed, right? They might talk in everyday speech and use a word that's been repressed. The word itself hasn't disappeared from their language, right? They can still use it. But it's the signifying function that has been repressed. And what that is, it's not the word itself, but its connection to all of the other signifiers. So for Lacan, what is repressed isn't a word, it is a connection, a certain network or a connection. And it's this configuration of this network of signifiers that makes up the unconscious.
Another thing that, thank you for elaborating on that, Eric. Another thing that I was just kind of thinking about was just the consequences of not taking Freud seriously in the sense of like when he said that the symptom of, you know, having this given consciousness, and how science still doesn't really take seriously the idea of the unconscious. Because it really, for me, now that I read Hegel, now that I'm beginning to read Hegel, I'm starting to see that the consequences are way more drastic than I had really expected. Because when I think about it, when I think about the way we treat the mind or psychology or anything, the only thing that we're treating is the thing, the given, right? I want you to be a functioning being, just a given. There's nothing that overcomes my being. There's nothing that is helping me overcome my being. There's nothing helping me to advance my being. All that we want to advance, at least that we think that we're advancing, is just the thing. The given. We want to go back to the given all the time. And this is why I feel like Hegel is so significant when we start thinking about Freud on top of that, because Freud really nails that we have the symptom of the given. We need to avoid the symptom of the given, overcome the symptom of the given. But besides that, I was thinking about, you know, how when Cadell elaborated on the fact that the consciousness is not the center. It made me think in the Hegelian fashion that if we talk about the unconscious as the thing itself, as it is in itself, and then the consciousness as for itself, for the other, I thought this was like a very interesting interaction. And then it made me think of when Hegel does the thing where consciousness does a comparison in itself. It does a comparison. And then it creates a new object, which I found really interesting because it's like Freud's model, that's the test, right? That's the test. When you're doing the passing through to see what object comes out. I don't know. I just these were just thoughts I was having. I'm not trying to assert anything crazy, but I was just having fun thinking in this fashion, and sort of doing some type of parallels that there is something just of interest there for me. Other than that, you know, that's it.
Yeah, in this paper, perhaps in particular, perhaps because Freud explicitly refers to Kant and explicitly refers to the way Kant revolutionizes our understanding of perception as subjectively conditioned vis-a-vis the in itself, there seems to be so much obviously at stake in the relationship between psychoanalysis and idealism. It's never been more obvious to me than in this paper, and anyone who's a a close reader of both traditions, I don't see how you can escape at least putting them into dialogue or putting them into conversation. And in particular, but at the same time, what's crazy about Hegel is that everything he does with Kant as it relates to the in itself and the noumena is still something that Freud seems completely unaware of. And I think that has huge consequences for how he's capable of even interpreting what he's discovering in the unconscious. So I think that there's a lot to think here. But yeah, the relationship between the in itself and the for itself is here clearly at work in the way Freud's thinking about unconscious resistance and the becoming of our psyches. So great point. Evren?
I would like to make a short contribution about the distinction between the collective and individual unconscious. I'm referring to Mladen Dolar here, who is obviously on the side of Freud, in contrast to Jung's collective unconscious. So the unconscious is neither individual nor collective. So according to Mladen Dolar, the unconscious is intervening at the link between the two. So it is neither individual nor collective. So this is what I would like to say briefly about the distinction between collective and individual unconscious.
Very precise, very clear. That's very interesting to think also in relationship to what Eric was talking about there at the beginning. So thank you for that. Chitan, are you cold?
Yeah, I'm not well actually. I'm just recovering
Oh
from
my
COVID.
goodness.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think just to add to what I think Evan is saying, I think one thing I think the distinction that Zizek makes actually that collective unconscious actually is more Hegelian in that sense in many ways. Hegel cannot think particular unconscious in that sense. Freud's unconscious is a particular unconscious. It is not something which is generalized. And how do we think through that turn that happened with Freud in that? And that's the, I think, challenge which is coming up in contrast to the collective unconscious actually becomes something which is, shared by everybody immediately and so on and so forth. But how do you think of an unconscious, which is, of course, an unconscious is unconscious of another at all points of time in that sense. But how do you think of an unconscious which is always manifesting itself in its particularity, not in its generic sense? I think that's one thing that I think immediately comes to mind, which is extremely, I think it's more a question than actually an answer to anything, to be honest.
Yeah.
The other, I think the other question of representation actually, what really interested me over there was, and even Eric's response and stuff was that how was Freud thinking of idea? Because for Freud, idea is essential to manifest our instinctual impulses. There are no instinctual impulses possible without it getting attached to idea, which is what even Eric was, I think, trying to get at when he was trying to talk about network of signifiers in that sense, that there has to be an emergence of idea for, and what is actually repressed is always, the idea itself in that sense. It's never direct. You cannot repress the instinctual impulse underneath it directly, and I think that's and that's something we need to be very it's something we need to really think about it. In what ways is of course one question of it is representation in that sense. The other question is in what ways are our ideas shaping up through this mechanism. Of course, I'll immediately make another point over and stop it here, that even in that question of repression of idea, there are two sides to it. One is the after pressure of repression, the other is the primal repression. And there is no repression possible without there being primal repression in that sense. Because even when you after repress something, that thing will keep on coming back. So at some level, you need to repress something because there is already primal repression, which is attracting everything else alongside it. So what is this relationship between primal repression and idea? That is something I think we need to think through in Eric's response.
The first thing, before I let Eric, he might have something directly to say here. The first thing I want to relate to, which is just fresh on my mind from the Hegel course, is that it seems to me the development of the idea in Hegel is a movement from universality to particularity to singularity. Or in the language you were giving, the general to the particular to, we could say then the singularity. And in that sense, I think that applying Hegel to the historicity of what's at stake in psychoanalysis is extraordinarily important. So fantastic link there, and I love thinking that. So yeah, it's wonderful to think. Eric, did you want to say something to what Chetan said?
I want to respond to that, and I think to look at Freud versus Jung in a Hegelian sense here, kind of mediated by Lacan, is I think the full Hegelian understanding here has to be that there is something at the level of spirit, at the level of the collective, that fails. And when that fails, there is a reversion back to the individual, right? And so if we think about these two extremes, on the one hand, we have the individual unconscious, which we could maybe say that's Freud. And then we have this, on the other extreme, this full collective, this unconscious at the level of spirit, which we could associate with Jung. Lacan is I think right in the middle, where he says, he understands, I think in the true Hegelian way, that this foray out into spirit and the level of the collective fails. And so there is a reversion back into the particular, so that the unconscious is, as Everin noted, is both. It is in the internal representation of what fails externally. It is the internal representation of that failure, that gap in the signifying chain at the level of the collective spirit. And then going on what you were talking about, this notion of primal repression and secondary repression, this is exactly what Lacan is the point he's trying to make with his master signifier, or S1, and then the rest of the signifying chain, S2. The master signifier is what is the primal repression. And then everything that's connected to that is the rest of the signifying chain, insofar as it is linked up with that primal repression. And that's why Lacan, I think, when he's talking about the unconscious as this network of signifiers, he's trying to be very faithful to what Freud is actually talking about here in terms of primal and secondary repression.
Can I sort of immediately say something?
Yes.
Yeah. Eric, my own reading probably on the question of repression is, I think it's great the way you sort of putting it up. My own reading around the question of the collective unconscious is slightly different, actually. The problem for me, at least when I read it and when I sort of listen to Zizek and so on and so forth, the problem with collective unconscious is actually not that it's collective. Freud's unconscious can be as collective as any Jungian unconscious can be in that sense. The problem, what is at stake in collective unconscious, and I think that is where Lacan is Freudian in that, in this sense. Not say we can have a discussion of one, can Hegel think Freudian unconscious in that sense. What is at stake in Freudian unconscious is not its collective or but individualistic nature, and that is where you can agree with everything. What is at stake is that collective unconscious cannot be the particular unconscious. It can only be generalized. It can only be something which we all immediately share.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Yeah, that's a good point to make. Yeah.
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 So the whole individual collective binary itself is problematic when we are discussing it, and it's a mistake that even it's a mistake that even I had made in my thinking for a lot of years, because I used to read Jung as a college student long back, and I used to feel very convinced with the collective unconscious idea, because I always saw the other being represented in unconscious at all points of time. It's only very much later I realized that Freud was way ahead in that sense, which Jung could not really think through. Freud already had the other in unconscious. That was never his point of difference with Jung. Point of difference with Jung was that Jung is not able to think the particular unconscious. And that's the, I think, with something which Zizek actually brings out much later in his work. And, he shows it that there's something radical happening there.
I think that's what Lacan really has in mind when he talks about this primal repression as being totemic. It's the totem, right, in the collective. It's this master signifier that exists in the collective that is the beginning of the signifying chain of repression. That's the primal repression. So I think maybe perhaps, and I don't know if Freud was able to think that far, but we could think of primal repression as being precisely that aspect of the unconscious that is collective.
Absolutely. And then when we sort of push this further, then we can sort of start then that is where we see the need that we need to supplement Hegel with Freud in that sense to get to Lacan. You need Hegel's negativity to be supplemented with this, and Hegel already foresees this. He just doesn't. He's not Hegelian enough where he needs to be more Hegelian in that sense. Hegel's own logic actually always foresees this particularity emerging. It's just he needs to be more Hegelian in those spaces to get to that point of thinking Freudian unconscious. Yeah, Jyoti. Sorry. Yeah.
I love the point. Sorry. Yeah, Jyoti, go ahead. I just wanted to make the point quickly that I love the emphasis here on Jung not being able to think the particular unconscious. I think that's precise, because that's what I've observed in the intellectual offsprings of Jung, is this inability to think the particular and to almost force identification with these ideational collective notions. Like, like you see these people produce products like identify with the king archetype, or identify with the magician archetype, or identify. This is like very, very problematic. But Jayati, go ahead.
Yeah, so actually, almost on the same lines, and when Chetan and Eric were discussing this collective unconscious being generalized, so this is something I wanted to share after reading this article. So when I finished this piece, and I have been going through my own personal journey, and I was thinking of guilt and struggling with my own guilt and how, from where does it come and all of it. And I was reading a story of a woman who went through Holocaust, and suddenly I experienced a collective guilt. I actually experienced. I'm a teacher in a university. I experienced the collective pain of a lot of students whom we have done quite a lot of disservice, I would say. And then I was thinking of this unconscious and what Freud is talking about, this zone of timelessness, which is there. He's talking of aboriginal, the presence of aboriginal, which is also over there. And I was trying to think that, is this the place where we can locate collective unconscious? And I was able to find collective guilt. I was able to experience some collective guilt. So I don't know if I'm like, if Chetan, if that's what you were hinting at. So yeah.
Chetan, did you want to respond to that, or?
Definitely, I think you're right there. That's why I said the collective question in the unconscious is not what is at stake in Freudian unconscious. For instance, things like collective guilt. I think there are very nice novels written by, there's a movie called The Reader. I think the person's whose novel it was written upon, how Germany experienced collective guilt after Hitler was gone. Even India's case of partition, for example, how India experienced a collective guilt about that violence that happened in partition. There are many such examples that you can come out and start thinking about that question. But that is not what is at stake in Freudian unconscious in that sense. Freud is able to think those questions. That is not the difference between Freud and Jung. I was just only making that. No, a lot of times we try and reduce Freud and Jung's debate to the question of collective and individual. I was just making that binary might not be the most productive. And but to be fair to Jung, there's a lot of things that Jung is emphasizing upon which we also should be, I think, conscious of. And that's for him. And how do we think about archetypes in Freud now? Those are real questions to ask in today's world. Yeah, sorry, Javier. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so the only thing that I could say I disagree is that maybe Jung did fail to answer the particular. I can entertain that, but I'm not sure that he never tried to answer the particular. I think he did try. And there's very instances where I read that Jung was actually very obsessed with the question of what is the individual? What is the individual? And the whole aspect of individuation is what he's obsessed with. How does someone, but then this is like the really Hegelian part, right? For Jung, once you individuate, it goes into the group, into the collective unconscious, and then you need another person to individuate. So it's like, in some aspects, it's like, yes, he was, but it was like almost in a dialectical process. Like you needed the particular to get to the universal, and then it's just a feeding loop. At least that's how I understand it. But I think the archetypes, it's a very distracting thing, because Jung says himself, he's like, the archetypes is nothing but instincts. The content is empty. And I think popular Jung psychology has completely just ruined, just completely stained what people actually kind of understand about Jung. Like it's just like, I don't know, like Jung says himself about the archetypes, it's literally instincts. And if you were trying to get he says that he uses the symbolism, and I think this is where he's kind of sincere to Freud. It's like where he's trying to make some word attachments so that way you can have some sense, some kind of meaning, and kind of bring it into the unconscious, like basically find your word. And I think that's where people kind of like get lost, is like Jung's trying to help you find your word. So it's like kind of find your archetype. And he's like throwing words in there to help bring something back into the consciousness. But ultimately, Jung says it's instincts. Archetypes is instincts, and the content is empty. Again, I would say that I'm not sure if he answered the particular. That is something that I would still leave open, obviously. But in my opinion, I do think he tried to answer the particular with his obsession about individuation and so on.
Can I ask you a quick question on that, Javier?
Yeah.
So the way I was trying to understand trying to historicize Freud's unconscious and the way Chetan emphasized its manifestation in the particular is through basically the dialectic of moving from universality, so like the unconscious as universality, to the unconscious as particularity, to the unconscious as singularity. So in some sense, and that's the basic, that's how I understand how the idea develops in Hegel to a state of absolute knowing. So how would you relate that development to what you were saying about Jung, where individuation constantly goes into the collective and then you need another person to individuate? Because that seems to me like Jung was operating with a model that individuations leading to some sort of collective identification, individuations leading to some sort of group harmony. Is that accurate?
I mean, it's like, I don't want to reduce it to that, but it's like, in some sense, like, because I feel like this is the Kantian part of Jung. I feel like this is the Kantian part of Jung, where it's like, you could say the noumenal kind of bounces back at you, because it like, I feel like, in my opinion, this is my reading of Jung, Jung kind of loses hope on the idea that there's going to be any real success, but he's hoping at the end that there's going to be this unity.
Yeah.
He's hoping at the end there's going to be some unity. I think somebody said like a bad infinity. That is definitely probably in that sign. But I think my loss of thought that I cannot connect is because I have a knowledge gap between the trifecta of which you just put down: the universal, the particular, and then the singular. That singular part is probably the part where I have the knowledge gap on, so I can't make that parallel. Yeah,
I think we should be very modest with finding complete answers, obviously, but interesting to keep thinking this. Eric?
Yeah, just two quick things on that notion of the singularity that you're talking about. I think that's what I was trying to get at with this notion of that the unconscious is the gap in the external signifying chain that is internalized. In other words, that's the resolution of the dialectic, the in and for itself. So what, there's this going out into the collective, and then it fails, and in that failure, what is in the collective is brought back into and subsumed into the unconscious. And so it's the singularity that is both the individual and the collective in the unconscious. I think that's really what Lacan gets to. And then to pick up on something else that Javier said in relation to Jung, that Lacan, the late Lacan especially, is very keen about. And really, I think it takes up the substance of the last Lacan, his last 4 or 5 years, is that the content of the unconscious, the content of what is repressed, is completely meaningless. It is nothing but what he calls la langue. It's just this babble. The signifiers that are repressed don't ever amount to anything that's meaningful. And all meaning, he says, knowledge, the knowledge that we gain from analysis is invented. Because the meaning that's present there is nothing except just babble, but it becomes this content for enjoyment, jouissance, the jouissance, the SENS, and that's the subject, or the content rather, of the unconscious. So I totally agree with what Javier said there, and that we should not look for any deeper meaning, like, oh, if I'm go to analysis and I'm going to try to uncover unconscious repression, like you're going to uncover some deep meaning about yourself. I think that's completely wrong, because the actual content of the unconscious is utterly meaningless.
Well, the thing that's coming out from a paper that I read by Zizek is that what confronts us in the unconscious is some sort of unbearable truth that we need to learn to live with. And I'm wondering if what he meant by that was this confrontation with a knowledge which destroys our meaning making, and or that our knowledge finds our knowledge and meaning making systems. Basically, that's what our knowledge and meaning making systems is. What find this content unbearable, or find this content difficult to deal with, because it in some sense reveals that there's no big other, that there's no underlying foundation for this meaning or this knowledge.
Exactly. The truth of untruth, or the truth that what is being repressed is just a meaningless sexual impulse connected to your mother, right? Which everyone, and I think this is the Zizekian point, is that it's precisely where we joke about Freud, where we joke about, your mom, that is the unbearable truth. And we have to joke about it in order to avoid really encountering that traumatic truth.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, because when you like when you're kind of predisposed to thinking in this way, you know, you can't help but read a lot of high level intellectual content as sort of they're representing something, but really what they're representing is their mom and their dad, but they don't know they're representing their mom and their dad. So it's, but it's that makes it even more hilarious. But anyway, Chetan, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Javier actually. And I actually take Javier's point. It's an anxiety which I also share, because when we are having a discussion and we are using Jung sort of as an opposite to actually make a point about Freud, we are not, if you know, we are not actually addressing what is the best argument from the Jung side. And let's be honest about it in that sense. You know, in this Freud and Jung debate, even when Lacan or Zizek, you know, contrast this Freud and Jung distinction, it's almost how we contrast man and animal distinction. It's not a comment upon the animal. It's just that the distinction is so productive that it says something about the man itself. You know, even if, you know, when we say animals don't have language, man does, we don't mean animals don't have language. We just mean the distinction is productive to say something about man.
I like that in this analogy, Freud is a man and Jung is an animal.
No, I'm not saying Freud is a man there. You know, I'm just saying that.
No offense.
Yeah, you know, I'm just saying that when we make these distinctions, one should be aware that these are not actual comments upon what Jung is saying a lot of time, because a lot of times we are not seriously engaging with what Jung is saying. It's say we have to engage with Jung with his best possible argument, which will be very different than what we are discussing here. That would be something to do with, you know, if you read, for example, Man and His Symbols, and you read it starting, and it's been a long time I've read it, and which is why it's become very difficult to talk about things which, you know, you're not that familiar with it immediately in that sense. When you look at Man and His Symbols, yeah.
I just wanted to say, and I would like you to actually, I would like to know your view on this, Chetan, is what I'm seriously talking about when it comes to Jung. Although I have read Jung and I've specifically paid close attention, because I'm very biased, I've paid close attention to Jung's comments on Freud. But what really I'm addressing when I talk about Jung is my experience of Jungian's own ideology. Like when I talk and interact with Jungians, and where I hear Jungians always going is identification with collective symbols which are universal to, like, and that's basically the horizon I experience, and I experience that as an obfuscation of understanding that person, because they're identifying with a universal, like I'm the king symbol. This is what I see as problematic in Jung, not necessarily Jung himself.
Yeah, I take your point there. But if I throw a challenge to you, let's see if we can, you know, get it. I'm playing the devil's advocate kind of a thing, but let's throw a challenge to you. Yeah. I had a shaman friend a long time back. You know, a friend who was a scientist and who was a shaman in that sense, and he used to deal with totems. Fine, and
deal with what?
Totems.
Totems.
So he was an Amerindian in that the Native Americans of that side, and he belonged to, I think, the Cherokee, or one of those tribes in that, you know. And in his culture, he had to engage with the question that he has to find a totem for himself. So at a young age, they would leave him in a forest alone with a knife, and he has to come back identifying with an animal back again. Fine. The one way to think about a tradition like this is that you might say what he's doing is rubbish and stupid and let's forget it. Fine. The other is that you translate it into the contemporary modern way and you start thinking in the Freudian way that how do we think through that idea of the totem. The idea of the totem over there is that he's trying to find his own spirit guide. It's not simply this simple collective question. It is very individualistic. Even in Jung, it's very individualistic. It's not simply that you are directly engaging with the collective. What you're doing is you're actually engaging, you are making that archetype your particular space in that sense. So what is at stake over there is that can we actually understand the experience of that shaman through the Freudian, or do we need a Jungian insight to actually go and engage with that shaman? Because if you go and use a Freudian grammar with that shaman, you lose him immediately. I've tried that. You lose him like that. He will not listen to you beyond a point. With the Jung's language, you can talk to him. Or if you have to talk to, for example, people, the tantrics, you may not be able to talk to them with your Freudian grammar. You'll not have that conversation, even though you can translate it for yourself. But that language breaks down because that you don't have the words, the vocabulary for it. Jung gives you a vocabulary for that. And that's where it becomes interesting if you want to make that space productive for yourself from that side. So if you're interested in those kind of questions, the real anthropological questions over there, I think Jung can be very, very fascinating, even today. I hope I'm making sense. I'm not in that sense. I'm purely talking like an anthropologist in that. One of my things is that when I go to the field, I have to find the language to be able to engage with, that particular area of experience and that particular, Yeah, I can hear you.
I think it's absolutely fascinating the way you're articulating yourself and what you're doing, because I mean, my biggest critique of Freud is that I do think he absolutely failed on the level of theological and metaphysical mysteries, just in terms of the way where he leaves us. I think in anthropology is absolutely insufficient. But yeah, it's very thought-provoking. Eric, did you want to jump in here? Or?
Yeah, I think it might be helpful here to understand the unconscious, like we're talking about in terms of Lacan's imaginary, symbolic, and real, where I think the Jungian notion of the unconscious, in my perception of it, we could call it the imaginary unconscious. That is, you have these archetypes that function as the imaginary, right? Whether you're a a shaman, in the forest, and you've uncovered this deep truth about yourself or something that you then you transfer onto this image of an animal or whatever. I think that whatever however we talk about that, if you're bringing in the concept of an archetype, that's something I think we would identify with the Lacanian imaginary. Now Lacan, the classic Lacan, we could call them the symbolic unconscious, and what Everin put in the chat from Zizek, I think, is precisely that. It's this network of the signifying chain. But then later in his career, Lacan will talk about the real unconscious, and this is something that was more Millerian, Jacques-Alain Miller, where the real unconscious is precisely what we're talking about, the meaninglessness of the unconscious. It's that horrific, traumatic truth of untruth, and I think where the real unconscious comes out is also in the real of the body. And I think this is something in Freud's text that I noted, just to kind of come back to the text that we're talking about, is when he's talking about hysterics and conversion disorder and schizophrenia, we're really talking here about, I think, the real of the unconscious, where it affects the body. And that's something that I think we have not dealt with adequately at all. And it's something that I think in the Lacanian world right now, there is a concerted effort to explore those topics. The notion of the body, the real unconscious. Tom Svolos is doing some really great work in that. If anyone wants to look up his recent couple of books and some interviews he's done. So yeah, I think maybe understanding the unconscious in terms of those three registers may be a helpful heuristic.
Yeah, I agree with that. In my own presentation on the difference between Freud and Jung, I basically placed Jung on the imaginary register as well. So makes a lot of sense to me, and also the distinctions you're making there between the real and the symbolic as it relates to the real as it relates to the meaninglessness, and the symbolic as it relates to the different neurotic. Yeah, Chetan?
Yeah, I remember Kettle's presentation, and that when Jung is imaginary in that sense. But if I invoke the anthropologist in me, the person who goes to the field, and I forget by the philosopher and the psychoanalyst, the problem becomes that when you actually make a claim of that nature, that what the shaman is doing is imaginary, you won't be able to connect to him on the field. When you are there, you have to take his experience to be real for yourself as an anthropologist, which is where philosophy needs to be informed with anthropology in today's time. In that sense,
but what about the imaginary real? What about the imaginary real? The imagination, not taking the imagination as a derogatory term, like it's unreal.
Exactly. Then you need a
There's an
different
imaginary real.
I agree, but then there's a different grammar you need to engage with him over there, and then you enter into Jung. Jung will not disagree with that. Then Jung has no issues with you, na? Minute you make that kind of a claim, Jung has no issues. Then the only problem is that you enter into the mystical realm. You enter into a realm where, as a psychoanalyst, as a practitioner psychoanalyst, you will enter into problems. I take that point. I take Freud's critique of Jung over there. But there is a cut over there which cannot be reconciled with the knowledges we have at this point of time. I'm just making that simple point over there. If you fall on too much on that side, you may lose something over here. And if you fall too much on this side, you lose something over there. There is something real at stake over here. It cannot be reconciled simply by playing certain mental, intellectual games over there. There is something real at stake over there when we take these take the anthropological question seriously. I think. For instance,
I agree.
For instance, if you read the text like Idris Shah's text on Sufis, where he directly engages with Jung, and his problem with Jung is that Jung is not going far enough, and he critiques Freud from that perspective, which almost all authentic spiritual books written in the past 100 years, they would have critiqued Freud on the same lines from that side. So there is something to be thought through over there, that you will fall on one side or the other depending upon what position you're taking towards modernity, and especially what position you're taking towards mysticism and so on and so forth. If you are sympathetic towards the mystical dimension, you will find something relevant in you. If you are not, you will not be able to relate to that side at all. And there is something to be thought through. I'm not saying whether Jung is right or Freud is right. That's not my interest. I'm not,
No, you're being extremely, extremely subtle.
Yeah. My own sort of academic work actually, of course, favors Freud. There's no denying that in that sense, personally, because I find him much more useful to account for. But I'm very open to using Jung whenever I would need to. in that sense.
Don't worry, Chetan. We're not going to scapegoat you. All right. I think though we should at least approach wrapping up. So if there's any further comments or reflections that are coming up, now's the time.
So I had one question. Yeah, can I go?
Yes.
Yeah. So I was just wondering, how do we understand present human condition, where so if we look at this particular piece, and whatever I've understood is that one way is to make all this conscious. One way of handling this is to make it conscious. But if you look at present human condition, we see that we have succumbed to the repressed instincts. There is a larger level of I can only think of the word how we have completely succumbed to them, and something which I think, Edel, you were also referring to when you were talking about today's instinctual animistic representation that are actually making rounds and the narcissism that we can see today. So how does one understand this phenomena? Because of course it is not about engaging with repression. And this is like a short circuiting which is happening, which is much more lethal to the times in which we are living.
Yeah, I mean, I think like not only when I was reading this paper, but also in the discussion now afterwards, I mean, it's clear that, you know, when we're reading Freud in 1915, Freud is limited in the sense that when he's talking about the unconscious in this paper, he's primarily talking about it from the point of view of what he's learned from the transference neuroses. But when we think about something like the modern phenomenon of narcissism, I mean, these are phenomena which Freud would lump as the non-transference neuroses. And in this paper, he's saying there's so much that's left obscure and confusing about our understanding of the unconscious, which we need to further develop through taking things like narcissism and schizophrenia more seriously. So to me, it's a very open question. How do we make sense of what Freud's talking about with the unconscious here in light of what I think is far more expressed in 2022, which is the phenomenon of narcissism and schizophrenia. Perhaps more so than the struggles some people may have with the transference neuroses. But I see it as, at least in my, and I would definitely want to leave it open for whoever else to respond here. But my first thought when I reflect on the behavior I observe is that these people are often expressing their narcissism in a artistic way. They're expressing their unconscious in an artistic way. That there's something about the dimension and domain of art that is something that transcends psychoanalysis, and gives us an outlet for our unconscious, that gives us a means to express it without repression, whether that's through sublimation or otherwise. I'm not sure. I'd be interested to know if anyone else has a point of view on that. But the triad that I try to make sense of outside of the context of psychoanalysis is that Hegel understood the absolute idea and its becoming on the level of art, philosophy, and religion. So I know Freud is biased towards art as a mode that transcends psychoanalysis, but I think he doesn't give enough appreciation to philosophy and religion. So Freud is not paying as much attention to philosophy and religion as he does art. So I think that these are things worth thinking about as it relates to how we deal with our instinctual representations, which brings us, I mean, when we think about religion, it brings us to archetypes. And when it brings us to philosophy, it makes us think about something, I think, completely outside the bounds of this conversation. I don't know if anyone else, if no one else has anything to say on that topic. Everin has his hand up.
Yeah, just a short final remark. I agree that Jung's mystical position is imaginary in the sense of Lacanian terms, but doesn't Lacan put symbolic before the imaginary? Because animals have imaginations as well. They can imitate, they can imagine, but making agreements written or oral and keeping their words is strictly human. I mean, isn't this?
But this is why Chetan put Jung on the level of the animal.
Yeah, I like that.
This was a joke. That was a joke.
I like the analogy, by the way. Yeah. That's all. That's the short final remark.
Just to sort of, if you want to take it further, the man-animal game, you would find that even there, the simplistic binary that animals do not have language do not work. Even there, that simplistic binary does not work. In fact, one has to be very conscious when the distinction can be productive to understand certain concepts. But when we're actually dealing with animals, and I'm reading a very interesting book these days, How Animals Grieve. It's an anthropological work. It's brilliant in terms of, way to understand that when you actually engage with animals, you can't go with the presupposition that they don't have what you.
Did Chitan freeze for everyone?
Yeah, he did.
Am I audible?
You froze for a
Yes,
moment
he
there,
did.
Chitan.
He's back.
Am I audible now? Yeah, sorry. I'm saying when you have to go and understand animals, when you have to, they don't have to have that involved. When you go and engage in the animal, you have to affirm their ability for language and their ability for emotions. It's only then that engagement is possible. So there is something real at lost when we use this binary between man and animal as something against animals than for man. That's the point I was trying to make. If we take that further to its logical conclusion, So what Lacan is saying is important to understand the man in that sense. Man as in man and woman both. I'm not being gender insensitive here. But when you actually have to go and engage in.
Oh, what's this? Chitan, you're freezing up. Maybe if you take off your video, Chitan.
Are there now? Yeah. I'm so sorry. My internet is actually. Is it better now?
Yeah, maybe if just your audio might be better.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I'm just saying that I think Elinka Zupanchi has a very nice discussion upon this man-animal distinction in her work, in her book, What is Sex, where she's arguing that it's not that animals don't have language and man do. Man is the inflection point of this transition from, no language to language in that sense. And all animals show signs of language in that. And then you reach to this. So I don't know if I made sense. I'm so sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, there might be something missed because of the freezing, but maybe something we can pick,
sorry, yeah.
maybe something we can pick up in a future session, this distinction between man and animals, symbolic and imaginary, and how it might relate to Jung and Freud.
Definitely. I was just making a basic point that when you have to go and engage with animals, when you have to engage with an animal, am I audible now?
Yep.
There, this distinction can be very counterproductive for you also. If you go with the assumption that animal is imaginary, animal doesn't have language, that assumption can be very counterproductive in your engagement with an animal. Do I make sense?
Yeah.
That's why.
All right. Well, I'm gonna reflect on that a bit tonight, Chitan.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me know what you think. Yeah.
Always insightful, all of you. Okay.
Cadell, question on art.
Yes.
I think that's exactly where I think Jung is important, actually. The aspect of the art part, because he does spend a lot of time talking about that, where it like exceeds. I think actually I read this through a summary of Muhammad Iqbal, where he actually talks about how Jung says that the art is something that goes beyond psychology. That it's something that's like that psychology cannot grasp. And so I think tackling Jung for the aspect of the art is something I think to look further into. And then the other thing is, when we talk about religion, though I am hesitant about using structures with that are try, mainly because I feel like the influence of Christian theology is so influential in that type of thinking in trifecta type of way. Because it's like, if you talk about Islamic theology, they don't think in Trinitary. They don't think in Trinitary. So it's like, sometimes I have to wonder, like,
do they have a different structure that they
yeah, like, I mean, like, it's like, I'm thinking, like, how different would we have to think? Like, I do find, I mean, what I'm trying to say is, I do find the Trinitary model helpful, but what I'm trying to say is that I feel like there's an influence of theology in this. And, you know, from a historical standpoint, Christians themselves, from way, way back, they used to argue about the Trinity itself. And so this aspect of, I mean, I'm just thinking, like, you know, how do we think non-Trinitary? How do we think a non-Trinitary model as such? You know, because I think for the intellectual understanding, it's helpful. But I think when Chetan brings up the point of, like, anthropological, you know, interaction, I don't know. I mean, it's just something that I think about, because it's like, I don't really encounter Islamic psychoanalysts, you know, or Muslim psychoanalysts, you know. So because they simply don't agree with the Trinitary aspect of God being man and there's Holy Spirit and everything. It's this very extreme, there is only God, meaning there is only God. Like, and the Sufis will say something like, it's reminiscent of A equals B. They say, when you experience a mystical experience, they say this: that is God, but not God, right? And there's instances of Muslims being killed because they say, I am God, but they don't understand what he's saying is that I am God, but not God. You know, so I don't know. I feel like there's a lot to dive in there, which I feel like I need Young to try to understand a little bit. You know,
we might need a few beers as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, there's a lot to say, but I don't know if we're going to solve the Trinitarian model of religious understanding in a few minutes here. but point taken. I do think that in the ideology of my philosophy and the ideology of probably what a lot of people here are influenced by, there is a reliance on triadic logic. I mean, the symbolic, the imaginary, the real, the universal, the particular, the singularity. Like, we're using triadic logical categories here. Freud's using the conscious, the pre-conscious, the unconscious. I mean, there's a lot of triads here, you know, like a phenomenology of spirit is a lot of triads, you know, like it's, so yeah, point taken. At the same time, I think the Hegelian point would be taken from the phenomenology of spirit would be that he's trying to break away from this one which cannot think historical process. You know, this absolute one, just there's one, there's God, and you know, that leads to extreme dogmatism for Hegel, which is his whole going on in the preface about A equals A, and the absolute one, which is sort of left just in the immediate intuition. But this is perhaps something we can take up in the Hegel course in greater detail, and maybe over a few drinks one time on your channel there. So I will I'll just wrap up here. I want to thank all of you for this conversation. As always, there's so much knowledge in this group and so many interesting perspectives, and I'm just always just left feeling very grateful for this space and for this ongoing project. So for the viewers watching afterwards, we covered a paper titled The Unconscious from 1915 by Freud. In this paper, what is most salient is Freud is attempting to, I think, distance himself from any interpretation of the psyche, which can be reduced to equal with consciousness. Psyche equals consciousness. Freud is trying to open up a model which is triadic, basically, introducing the concepts consciousness, pre-consciousness, and unconsciousness, their dynamics, how they work, the topography, the economics of this psychological model, and its effects and consequences on analytic work, and how we should understand the relationship between ultimately the instincts of the body and the way our mind struggles with acceptance, censorship of those representatives of the body. And then we had a long conversation, which of course always included some Lacan. In this situation also included a lot of very interesting tensions with Jung, which I'm very excited if we can keep bringing in these tensions, because I feel like they're quite, they introduce new ideas, they introduce new tensions, they introduce new perspectives, which I think are very, very worthwhile to think through. So that's all. Thank you guys, and I'll see you when I see you.
Thanks everyone.